If you grew up in motorcycling before 1990, you remember this. If you didn't, you've heard about it from your father or your uncle or the old guy at the gas station who shakes his head when you tell him what you just paid out the door. The 1970s American motorcycle dealership wasn't a sales floor. It was a community center. It was a meeting place. It was a clubhouse with a cash register in the corner. And the people who worked there weren't trained to extract maximum margin from every transaction. They were riders themselves. They wrenched on their own bikes at home. They raced on weekends. They lent tools to customers who couldn't afford to buy their own. The relationship between a dealer and a rider was not adversarial. It was vocational. They were on the same side of the table. What I'm going to walk you through in this video is exactly what that world looked like, what made it work, and the specific decade where it all started to die. We're going to talk about the showroom, the salespeople, the financing, the service department, the parts counter, and the unwritten rules that everyone followed. By the end of this video, you'll understand why anyone who bought a bike before 1980 looks at modern dealerships the way a man looks at the lot where his childhood home used to stand. And you'll understand exactly what was taken from American riders and who took it. Walk into a typical American motorcycle dealership in 1973. The first thing you notice is the size. Most dealerships were small, 2,000 square feet, maybe 3,000. Run by a single owner, sometimes a husband and wife team, sometimes two brothers, the building had been there for 20 years. It probably used to sell something else before motorcycles took off after Vietnam. The windows were dirty. The floor was concrete. There were oil stains. The walls had pegboard panels with parts hanging on hooks, marked with handwritten price tags. There was a coffee pot in the corner that nobody cleaned and nobody minded. The bikes on the floor were the inventory. There weren't 12 of each model. There were 3, maybe 4. A Honda CB750 in candy red, a Kawasaki Mach 3 in lime green, a Yamaha XS650 in black, maybe a couple of Triumphs, maybe a BMW or two if it was a multi-line dealer. The bikes were arranged in a way that made sense to riders, not to merchandisers. The fastest bikes were near the front window, the cruisers were in the middle, the dirt bikes were in the back near the service door. There were no spotlights. There were no demonstrator displays. There were no glossy signs telling you what a bike was supposed to mean about your identity. The bike on the floor was just a bike. You either wanted it or you didn't. The pricing was honest. The sticker on the bike was the price you paid plus tax. There was no dock fee. There was no freight charge added on top. There was no setup fee. The dealer had paid to ship the bike. The dealer had paid to assemble it. Those costs were already in the price you were looking at. The idea that the dealer would charge you separately for things that were already part of his cost of doing business would have struck a 1970s dealer as embarrassing. It would have struck him as unprofessional. It would have struck him as the kind of thing a man does when he doesn't have enough self-respect to look another man in the eye. I personally think that's the part of this story that gets lost the most. The reason 1970s dealers didn't run modern fee structures wasn't because they couldn't think of them. It wasn't because the regulations were stricter. It was because they would have been ashamed to. The people running those dealerships were members of the same community as the people buying the bikes. They went to the same diners. They drank at the same bars. They saw their customers at the gas station the next week. You couldn't sell a man $1,000 in junk fees on Saturday and expect him to sit next to you at the Lions Club meeting on Tuesday. The community itself was the regulation, and the community held together because everyone in it depended on everyone else. The man who sold you the motorcycle wasn't a salesman in the modern sense. He was a rider who happened to work at the shop. Most dealerships in 1970s America had 2 or 3 full-time employees, 1 owner, 1 mechanic, 1 floor guy who answered phones, helped customers, and ran parts when the place got busy. That was the staff. There were no sales managers. There were no general managers. There was no F&I director. There was no business development manager. The job titles that fill modern dealerships hadn't been invented yet because the work they describe didn't exist yet. The floor guy in 1970s didn't work on commission. Or if he did, the commission was a flat $30 or $50 per bike sold. He had no incentive to push you into something more expensive than you needed. He had no incentive to add products you didn't want. His job was to match the customer to the right bike and send him home happy. Because if the customer went home happy, the customer brought a friend back the next month. If the customer went home angry, the dealer lost 10 years of future business and word of mouth in a town where word of mouth was everything. That math was clear to everyone working in those buildings. The long-term relationship was worth more than the short-term transaction. Always. I personally think the most beautiful thing about a 1970s dealership salesperson was that he would talk you out of a bike. If you walked in wanting a Kawasaki Mach 3 because your buddy had one, and the floor guy could tell you weren't ready for that bike, he would tell you so. He would steer you to a smaller machine. He would tell you to come back next year and trade up. He understood that selling you the wrong bike meant selling you a hospital visit, or selling you a quit, or selling you a story that got told at the bar about the dealer who put a beginner on a death machine. None of that was good for him, so he protected you even when it cost him a bigger sale. Try to find that today. You will not. The conversation around the sale was not high pressure. There was no closing technique. There was no urgency manufacturing. The floor guy didn't tell you the bike would be gone tomorrow. He didn't tell you the price would go up. He didn't tell you he could only hold it for an hour. He told you to think about it. He told you to come back. He told you to bring your wife or your father or whoever you wanted, because he knew the bike wasn't going anywhere. There was always another customer next week. He didn't need to squeeze you. He just needed you to choose him over the dealer in the next town. Here's where the modern story breaks the hardest. In 1970s America, most motorcycles were paid for in cash. A Honda CB750 in 1973 cost about $1,700. The average American working man in 1973 made about $10,000 a year. A new motorcycle was roughly 2 months of gross pay. Saving for it was reasonable. Paying cash was common. Riders who couldn't pay cash often saved up for half and paid the other half through a personal loan from a local bank or credit union arranged before they ever set foot in the dealership. When financing did happen at the dealership, it was simple. The dealer had a relationship with one or two local banks. Maybe the local credit union. The dealer didn't make money on the financing. The dealer just facilitated it. There was no buy rate. There was no markup. There was no spread. The bank quoted a rate. The customer either took it or didn't. And that was the end of it. The dealer made the same profit on the bike whether you paid cash or financed. He had no incentive to push you toward a longer loan, a higher rate, or a worse deal. The financing was a service, not a profit center. There was no F&I office. Let me say that again, because it's so important to understand how different the two worlds are. There was no separate room. There was no second person. There was no extended warranty pitch. There was no gap insurance pitch. There was no paint protection pitch. There was no theft etching scam. There was no tire and wheel coverage. There was no prepaid maintenance. None of those products existed yet, and the ones that did exist were not bundled into a high-pressure sales meeting at the moment of vulnerability. If you wanted insurance, you bought it from your insurance agent the next week. If you wanted an extended warranty, no such thing existed. The bike was warrantied by the manufacturer for 12 months, and that was the deal. Take it or leave it. Most riders left it because they planned to wrench on the bike themselves anyway. I personally think the absence of the F&I office is the single biggest difference between then and now. Modern riders walk into a dealership and assume the backroom sales process is normal. They assume it's been there forever. They assume that's just how motorcycles get sold. It isn't. It's a structure that was invented and inserted into the buying process specifically to extract money from riders who had already decided to buy. It is a relatively recent addition to the American motorcycle dealership. And the riders who came of age before it existed remember exactly how clean a transaction can feel without it. Walk through the back door of any 1970s American motorcycle dealership and you walked into the soul of the operation. The service department was where the money got made, but more importantly, it was where the trust got built. The mechanic, almost always one man, sometimes two, was the face of the dealership for any rider who owned a bike for more than a year. The salesman sold you the bike once. The mechanic kept you alive on it for the next decade. Service rates in 1970s America were honest. A typical shop charged $6 to $10 an hour for labor. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $50 to $80 an hour today. Compare that to modern dealer service rates that run $150 to $250 an hour at the manufacturer authorized service centers. The mechanic in 1970s didn't pad hours. The flat rate book existed, but it was used as a guideline, not as a weapon. If a job took 2 hours, you paid for 2 hours. If it took an hour and a half, you paid for an hour and a half. The mechanic didn't bill you 4 hours and pocket the difference. He told you what was wrong, he told you what it would cost, he did the work, and he handed you the bike back. The mechanic in the 1970s also taught you. Riders who hung around the service bay learned how to do their own valve adjustments, their own carb sinks, their own oil changes, their own brake bleeds. The mechanic didn't see this as competition. He saw it as community. He knew that the rider who could do his own oil change would still bring the bike in for the harder jobs. He knew that teaching a young rider to work on his bike was an investment that came back as loyalty for 30 years. The dealership was a school as much as it was a service center. The parts counter sold you parts at fair prices, and the mechanic told you how to install them. None of this exists in the modern dealer service department. The modern dealer service department is structured to make sure you cannot do anything yourself. The bikes are designed to require dealer tools. The diagnostic codes are locked behind dealer software. The right to repair has been quietly stripped away over 40 years of corporate consolidation, and the rider who would have learned a wrench in a 1970s shop now has to pay $180 an hour to a stranger to do work he could have done in his own garage if anyone had ever taught him. I personally think this is the loss that hurts the most. Not the price of the bike, not the fees, not the markup. The loss of the rider who knows his own machine. The loss of the man who can pull a clutch cable on a Saturday morning while his neighbor watches and asks questions. That world existed and the modern dealer system killed it deliberately because a rider who can fix his own bike doesn't pay for the service department. The parts counter in a 1970s dealership was its own institution. A long wood counter, sometimes glass on top, with a guy behind it who knew every part number for every bike that had come through the shop in the last 15 years. He had a paper catalog, sometimes microfiche if it was a bigger dealer. He could look up a part for a 1968 Triumph in about 90 seconds. He'd order it from the regional warehouse. It would show up in 3 to 5 days, and he'd call you when it arrived. You paid retail and the markup was reasonable, maybe 20% over what the dealer paid wholesale. That was the margin. That was the deal. The parts guy also kept an unofficial swap shelf. Used parts that had been pulled off trade-ins, bolts and brackets and small bits that didn't have a home. If you needed a 30-cent washer and you were a regular, he'd just hand it to you. No charge. The understanding was that you'd buy your bigger items from him too, and that was enough. Modern dealerships have eliminated this entirely. Every part has a barcode. Every barcode has a system. Every system has a corporate margin requirement. The parts guy who could just hand you a washer doesn't exist anymore because there's no line in the inventory system for human judgment. The parts pricing in 1970s wasn't predatory. Compare a Honda 750 oil filter in 1975 at about $3 retail to the same equivalent oil filter today at $15 to $20 at the dealer counter. Adjusted for inflation, the modern part is at minimum twice the price. The dealer parts counter has become one of the highest margin business units inside any modern dealership. 40 to 60% gross margin on parts is now standard. 20% was the 1970s standard. The difference again comes from the same place. The community accountability that kept margins honest in 1970s has been replaced by corporate margin targets that don't care if you ever come back, because they know you'll come back anyway. There's nowhere else to go. Every 1970s American motorcycle dealership ran on a set of unwritten rules that nobody had to teach because everyone already knew them. The dealer didn't sell to a beginner the bike that would kill him. The dealer didn't run financing on a customer who couldn't afford the bike. The dealer didn't add fees that weren't part of the original price. The dealer honored verbal commitments. If the floor guy said the price was $16.95 out the door, the price was $16.95 out the door. There was no surprise at signing. There was no different number on the contract than the number that was quoted in the showroom. A man's word was the contract. The piece of paper at the end was just paperwork. The dealer also stood behind the bike after the sale. If you bought a bike on Tuesday and something failed on Friday that wasn't your fault, the dealer fixed it. No argument. No invocation of fine print. No escalation to corporate. The dealer fixed it because the dealer's reputation depended on it. The dealer also took trades fairly. If you came in with a 3-year-old bike to trade against a new one, the dealer offered you a price that left you whole. He didn't lowball you and then resell the trade for double. He took a fair margin on the trade, and that was that. I personally think the Unwritten rules were the strongest part of the system, stronger than any law, any regulator, any contract. The Unwritten rules existed because the people who worked in those buildings cared about being thought well of in their own town. They cared about their reputation more than their next quarter. They knew that a single act of dishonesty in a small motorcycle community would kill their business in a month. So they didn't do it, not because they couldn't, because they wouldn't. That's the part of the 1970s dealership that no regulation can recreate. You can't legislate self-respect. You can't regulate community accountability. Once those things are gone, they're gone. And what fills the space is exactly what we have now. So when did it all die? The honest answer is the 1980s. Specifically, the period between 1978 and 1985. 3 things happened simultaneously, and they killed the 1970s American motorcycle dealership in slow motion across about 7 years. First, the dealer consolidation began. The small 2,000 square foot family dealership couldn't compete against the new 10,000 square foot multi-line stores that started opening in suburban shopping districts. The big stores had inventory the small stores couldn't match. They had financing relationships the small stores couldn't access. They had marketing budgets the small stores couldn't afford. By 1985, the average American town had lost its independent dealer and gained a regional chain operation. The owner of the regional chain didn't live in your town. He didn't drink at your bar. He didn't see you at the diner. The community accountability that had kept the 1970s system honest was severed in 1 decade. Second, the F&I office was invented. Imported from automotive retail, which had already perfected the backroom extraction model in the 1960s, the F&I structure was bolted onto motorcycle dealerships starting around 1980. By 1985, almost every major dealer had a separate finance office, a separate finance manager, and a stack of products to push. The transaction was no longer a single conversation. It was now a 2-stage process designed to maximize extraction at each stage. Third, the manufacturer started enforcing dealer agreements that required minimum margins, minimum F&I attach rates, minimum customer satisfaction targets, and minimum facility investments. Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Suzuki. All of them. The dealer who wanted to keep his franchise had to play by the new rules. The rules were structured to favor the larger, corporate, finance, and insurance-heavy stores. The rules made the 1970s style of dealership economically impossible to operate. Even the dealers who wanted to keep doing things the old way couldn't, because the manufacturer would pull their franchise if they didn't hit the new performance targets. I personally think the manufacturers carry the heaviest blame for what was lost. The dealers who sold out and converted to the new model were responding to incentives. The manufacturers designed those incentives. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the 1970s dealer culture was profitable for the dealers, but not maximally profitable for the manufacturers. They knew that consolidating dealers into bigger corporate stores would drive higher wholesale orders, higher finance and insurance attach rates, and higher accessory revenue. They knew the community-based, rider-centered model would have to die for them to grow. So they killed it, not with a single decision, with 20 years of small decisions that all pointed the same direction. By the time anyone noticed what was being lost, the loss was already complete. What we lost wasn't the price. The price is the easy part. We lost a system in which the man selling you the bike was a member of your community, accountable to you, invested in your long-term satisfaction, willing to talk you out of a bad decision, willing to teach you to maintain your own machine, and willing to honor his word with his handshake. We lost a service department that cared more about its reputation than its margin. We lost a parts counter where a 30-cent washer didn't need a barcode. We lost a culture in which the dealer and the rider were on the same side of the table. What remains is the building, the same square footage, sometimes the same address. But the soul that made it a dealership in the 1970s sense is gone. What's there now is a sales operation dressed up to look like a dealership. The signs are still red and white, the bikes are still on the floor, there's still a coffee pot somewhere, but the man behind the counter is paid on commission to extract maximum margin from every customer. The man in the back room is paid to bolt on every product he can fit on the contract, and the man in the service department is billing flat rate hours that have nothing to do with how long the work actually takes. Some independent shops still exist. There are still men running 1970s style operations in small towns across America. They're rare. They're aging out. Their kids don't want to take over the business because the corporate dealer model has made independent operation almost economically impossible. But they're out there, and if you can find one, you'll know it the moment you walk in. The smell will be right. The coffee pot will be there. The handshake will be real. And the price you're quoted will be the price you pay. If you bought a motorcycle in 1970s America, you got something that no modern rider will ever experience. You got a transaction with another human being who shared your interests, respected your judgment, and treated you like a member of his community. You got a price that was the price. You got a service department that cared whether you came back. You got a parts counter that handed you a washer when you needed one. You got a man's word as the contract. You got the kind of buying experience that built the entire American motorcycle culture, generation after generation, until somebody in a corporate office decided it wasn't profitable enough to continue. I personally think the riders who lived through the 1970s American motorcycle dealership era and are still alive today carry something the rest of us will never have. They carry the memory of what it should look like. They know in their bones that the modern dealer system is not how it has to be. It's not how it always was. It's a recent invention. It can be undone. The independent shops that still exist prove it. The community-based dealer model is still possible. Somebody just has to want it badly enough to fight for it. If this video meant something to you, drop a comment below. Tell me about the dealer you grew up with. Tell me his name. Tell me his town. Tell me what he taught you, what he sold you, what he charged you, what he honored. I read every comment. Pass this video to one rider in your life who lived through it and one rider who didn't, so they both know what the rest of us are trying to remember. Like the video, hit subscribe, and ride safe. Spend smarter.